Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerard Gibert, and it has been my honor and privilege to serve as the chairman of the board of Empower Mississippi since the inception of the organization in 2014. It's really been a great ride with such a fantastic team committed to helping all Mississippians thrive, breaking down those barriers. We have certainly achieved much, I believe, over that time period, but much work is left and remains, and that's why we have some experts with us today to help guide us and give us some thoughts on where we should be going. So we welcome first Jonathan Williams with the American Legislative Exchange Council. So Jonathan, as Grant talked about and highlighted in the video, Mississippi enacted the largest income tax cut in the state's history in 2022, and that propelled Mississippi from 27th to 22nd in your latest Rich States, Poor States report. Tell us a little bit about how the state's income tax cut, how that impacted our rankings.
Well, happy to do it. And first of all, greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where I come from, or these days known as the place of the rich men north of Richmond, right? And it's good to be out in the states, and that is where the action is happening across the country. And I think is maybe a theme to today. You know, we've got real challenges in Washington, but what's happening here in Mississippi with the tax cuts, what's happening in states all across the country with real tax reform that empowers people, that empowers entrepreneurs, that empowers small businesses, is something that Washington can learn a lot from. And to get to the point of, you know, how we rank Mississippi in the new Rich States, Poor States, it was one of the biggest winners in 2023, moving up those 5 places. And of course, there's something, you know, I think that's important. We find something good and something as an opportunity for conditional improvement, right, in everything. And we rank the 50 states. And you know, I've been doing this for 16 years now. I traveled the 50 states multiple times over. And, you know, when we see a state like Mississippi that, you know, when you look, and by the way, I have handouts for everybody that goes through the rankings of how Mississippi ranks in the new Rich States, Poor States in more detail. You can also go to richstatespoorstates.org. And you look at the population loss, for instance. You all have seen it. You've lost neighbors. You've lost friends, people that have moved to other states for economic opportunity. And to see a state that it was able to begin to turn things around like Mississippi has is really, I think, an inspiration to states all across the country. So congratulations and to your lawmakers in the room. I know it took a lot of courage and a lot of leadership to get these tax cuts done. Now, that being said, there's a lot more work to be done as well, because going from 27th to 22nd in 1 year is a great improvement, but it's not like your marketing arm of the state and your economic development folks are going to come in and say, go across the country and say, come into our state, we're number 22, right? There's a lot more work to be done, and you're in a very competitive region. I don't need to tell you that. When you have Tennessee, when you have Texas, when you have Florida, when you have North Carolina, when you have Arkansas, that just in the last week, you heard from the senator just doing amazing things on education freedom, but they also just cut taxes again last week and begun to reduce income tax rates even more. And let me one other thing I think it's important to note as the ranking goes. You know, in our Rich States, Poor States economic outlook score that we're talking about here, it only incorporates a portion of what was done so far in Mississippi. And so the good news, I think, will continue in the next year's edition that comes out in April, and in the next year's edition from that, as the tax cuts actually do phase in and we see the actual marginal rates going down starting next tax year. Right. You get credit for it already because you enacted legislation that cuts taxes, but there's more good news ahead. Of course, what happened with the full expensing this year is really only Oklahoma going before you on that. I think that just adds to it. So, I mean, impressive work. I think there's more to be done, but I think it's really important what you started.
Yeah, so John Caldara with the Independence Institute of Colorado. So, as Jonathan was mentioning, our sweeping tax reform, of course, we had 3 brackets in Mississippi. The 3% bracket was already previously eliminated. In this particular legislation, we phased it in by starting with elimination of the 4% bracket, and now we'll be phasing out or reducing, I should say, the 5% bracket, phasing out 1% of that 5%, so that we'll have one flat tax rate of 4% on all taxable income at that point. But Our state, as was mentioned earlier today, produced a very tidy surplus, and it has for the last couple of years. And although we came in with revenue that was some $700 million above revenue estimates, we also spent $600 million less than we took in as well. So we had a significant surplus in the fiscal year that ended 2023. You guys got something in Colorado that's very intriguing. It's the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, also known by the acronym TABOR. And so in that situation, that's something we don't have here. When you got more money than you spent and you end up with a surplus, it actually goes back to the taxpayers, if I'm
The
not
idea
mistaken.
is that it goes back to the
Okay.
taxpayers. First, congratulations on the tax cuts. We did the same thing back in the mid-'80s. Got rid of 3 tax brackets, brought it down to 5%. Since then, through the Independence Institute, we've been able to bring it down to 4.4% on our what we call our path to zero, on a long-term path to bringing it to zero, which will take years and years and years to do. Colorado is a western state, at least it used to be a western state until the Californians came and turned it into a West Coast state. The goal is, in Colorado, we've never really trusted politicians. And so in our Constitution, we have the initiative process, which allows citizens like me to occasionally put something on the ballot to get around the politicians. That's why we have open meetings laws and open records laws. It's why we have the term limits. It's also why we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's in our state constitution. And the whole idea is merely consent for taxation. It does a couple basic things. It says if you want to raise taxes on any level of government, in our many thousands of districts in Colorado, you can do so. You just have to ask permission to the voters. If you want to go into debt, all you have to do is ask to do so. And for the most part, government can grow at the level of population growth plus inflation. And if you get more money than that, the government can keep it. All they have to do is ask permission. And anything above that, if the people say, no, we want the money, the government's supposed to give it back. Now, as you can imagine, something as wonderful and as happy as that is not going to last too long because the government's going to figure out ways around it. And over the 30 years that we've had this enacted, they have found myriads of ways to get around it. But let me give you a quick happy news about it. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, while the country was having a boom, we got billions and billions of dollars back to taxpayers in refunds, just like what you're talking about now. And so many states were spending that money, if you recall. That was the tech boom, and they were saying, we've got to spend this money. Well, when government gets that extra money, they don't spend it on pizza and beer, the way that ALEC does. They actually spend it on new programs. And every time government spends $1, it means that they're guaranteed to spend $1.05 the next year. And in Colorado, they said, look, we're missing out. Our kids need the education. All this stuff happens. But instead, we gave the money back, and our budget stayed about like this. Whereas in California, the budget grew and grew and grew and grew. And then the recession hit when the bubble popped. Out in California and so many other states, the budget plummeted, and the pain happened. In Colorado, we felt no budget pain in the state government because TABOR kept it lean. It saved our fiscal fanny, and we felt no pain at all. In other words, for the legislators, all of whom hate TABOR, Republicans and Democrats alike, it saved them. It helped them. They didn't have to anger their constituents. Why do I say Republicans hate it? They all hate it because it forces elected officials to do their job, which means setting priorities. You either have to disappoint this constituent or that constituent when you have extra money. That's something politicians don't like to do. Or you have to go to the people and convince them to keep your money. Now, the bad part. The Colorado Supreme Court continues to poke holes in ways to keep the money. You can ask to keep the money for 4 years. The Supreme Court ruled that 4 years sounds an awful lot like forever. So now most of the governments in Colorado have an override forever. The state hasn't, and a few other big districts haven't. They've also said that you can't raise taxes without a vote, but you can raise fees without a vote. So now everything is a fee, and the state government has ballooned in size. And in 2005, they passed a statewide raise in the cap by just, we fought it but lost, and now some $30 billion as many years later, and they jacked it up. Interestingly, and I'll leave it at this, the exact same thing happened, if you remember, leading up to 2008. Our budget soared and soared and soared, but this time, Tabor was not able to cap it. The new cap went to whatever the highest that was going to be in that 5-year period. It was called Referendum C. And so that level went up right with it, and then 2008 happened, and we went like this. And all of a sudden, we were California back before, and we had the hurt. You might remember back then, California was so upset they recalled a governor and put a Terminator in for the governor. This is what Colorado happened. The lesson is this protection works. Every state should do it. Every state should learn from our mistakes and write it in a way that the legislature and the courts can't weasel around it. Because Tabor is now just a skeleton of what it used to be, but is what the Wall Street Journal called the gold standard of tax and expenditure limitations. It is something that works. And the fact that it has been under assault since the day it passed some 31 years ago is proof of just how effective it is. And we were very proud to be part of its birth.
Appreciate that, John. Russ, I think anytime you talk about pro-growth economic policy, such as meaningful, substantial tax reform, tax reduction, as we did here in the state of Mississippi, and limited government, fiscally responsible spending, something they know nothing about in Washington. Of course, we have to balance our budget here to make the books work in Mississippi. But you also have to think about one of the primary benefits of those policies being to enable the private sector, incentivize the private sector to invest, to hire, to create meaningful job opportunities for people so that they can earn nice, handsome incomes, hopefully realize the American dream, take care of their families, and just enjoy a high quality of life that we expect here in this country. And there are different ways of measuring progress and performance with respect to jobs. One of those is the labor force participation rate. Doesn't really get a lot of attention.
Nothing sexier than talking about labor force participation rates.
It certainly
I
doesn't
can tell y'all are excited, right?
And Jonathan, you could probably attest to this as well. We don't see that talked about a lot in the halls of Washington. The focus typically is on unemployment or so-called job creation. Help us understand what the difference is on those high-level measurements.
Well, you know, before I get into labor force participation rate, I think it's important to recognize that Mississippi has made progress, right? A lot of times people talk about Mississippi as being 50th in everything, and there's this mental model that says we're last in everything. I want to give you some sense of where the progress has been, right? So in 2003, our state GDP was about $79 billion, give or take a few. Okay, today our state's GDP is $139 billion. So we've nearly doubled the size of our economy in a 20-year period in the state of Mississippi. In 2003, the average income, per capita income in Mississippi was about $21,000. Today it's $46,000. So we've more than doubled per capita income in the state of Mississippi. Our unemployment rate in 2003 was 6.2%. It's 3% today, the lowest it's ever been. So we've more than cut in half the unemployment rate. And all of those things are signs of an economy that is showing progress. You know, very frequently people will confuse the well-being of government with the well-being of an economy. A government doesn't have to be big if the private sector is producing, if jobs are being created, if people are being able to take care of their own families. And so there is stuff to be proud of in the state of Mississippi. The problem is that not everybody has participated in that growth, okay? So if you want to think about it this way, let's say you've got 100 people standing around a wagon, and 52 of them harness in to pull the wagon. 45 climb in the back, and then there are 3 people looking for a place to get harnessed in so they can help pull the wagon. That's our employment picture in a nutshell, and I'll explain what I mean. So 3% unemployment is literally there are 3% of people who are of a certain age, who are out looking for work, who don't currently have it, right? That only tells one part of the picture. The bigger part of the picture is that about 45% of Mississippi's population over the age of 16 is not looking for work. They're not in the workforce. They're not out looking for work. And so what that means is that you've literally got 52 out of those 100 people pulling the cart and 45 people in the back of the cart. That's unworkable or untenable long term if we're ever going to compete with other states. So the national average is about 63%. We're at 54% as a state. It's the lowest in the country. We're literally talking about out of every 100 people that you would expect to be in the workforce, 8 of those people are in the back of the wagon instead of pulling the wagon. And that's why it's harder for us to compete with some of these other states. But it doesn't mean that the state is not having progress. What we've got to do is figure out how to get people who are currently in the back of the wagon up to the front of the wagon pulling. Because if we can do that, we can compete with any state in the country. We're already seeing that through some of the policies that we've got. We just got to get more people off the sidelines and into the game.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. So, Jonathan, in addition to the sweeping income tax reform, individual income tax reform that was enacted in Mississippi in 2022, this past legislative session, we also finally got legislation through that allows full expensing of business investment in certain capital equipment and other assets in the year that they are placed into service. That's always been kind of a reconciling item in Mississippi income taxes with federal income taxes, because that is allowed, although it's being phased out somewhat. That was enacted in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Actually, it was expanded quite a bit. But this is something that businesses key in on when they're thinking about making major investments in their business on computer systems, office equipment, plant and equipment, and so forth. Those sorts of assets that qualify for reducing their tax burden. And we should point out, this doesn't actually eliminate any income tax liability. It simply defers it. It allows you to sort of pull it forward, that deduction now, as opposed to depreciating assets over an extended period of time. How important do you think that is in working to just boost a state's economy?
I think it's very important. Let me just address the federal piece of it quickly, because I think it's an important part of this. And if you had to ask, yourselves or your neighbors, what does Washington do best today? It is probably the answer is nothing. Gridlock, right? And that is Washington's famed skill, is a gridlock these days. Whether you like that or you don't like that, whether you're Republican, a Democrat, independent, libertarian, vegetarian, doesn't matter your partisan affiliation, right? You need to look at Washington for what it is today. It's gridlock. That all being said is because of some very complicated Senate procedural rules and tax law, whenever something passes in a tax bill in recent memory, the Bush tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, comes with a time frame on them, that they expiration date, so to speak. So by the end of 2025, every single individual side tax provision from that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was, I think, an incredible overall piece of package that made the United States more competitive on the business tax side and helped a lot of everyone here with standard deduction increases and other things. That all goes away in 2025, but even before that, some of the business provisions do start phasing out. We're starting to see that. That all being said, I think there's about 18 states that hitch their wagon, so to speak, to the federal treatment of expensing. And as the federal treatment now goes away and becomes less generous, of course, there's the uncertainty problem, right? That there's always this ambiguity of what's going to happen with federal tax law. And that, of course, keeps capital on the sidelines. We know that to be the case. And so the fact that Mississippi has stepped out from the pack and said, it's Oklahoma first, Mississippi second, to have full expensing, I think is an incredible powerhouse tool that you can use to attract businesses to your state. Some of the survey data that I've seen suggests that full expensing for some business types could be as valuable as lower rates in terms of the marginal income tax. And obviously you need to do both, right? Because there's this, you don't enact policy in vacuums. And while you did some very good things on the income tax and, or of course, on expensing, other states aren't, standing still either. And I think it's one of the key lessons from our 16 years of putting together the Rich States, Poor States report is you can fall behind by standing still. And so keeping that momentum going is going to be really important, because just in the last 3 state legislative sessions, we've seen 24 states substantially reduce personal income taxes as being one of the biggest ways to get bang for the buck on the personal side. Certainly if you're a pass-through entity, if you're a small business, the vast majority of them pay on the individual side of the codes. That's why it's important to continue to work on the individual tax rates. Becoming a flat tax is a big way to do that, and cutting rates. But on the other side, for the C Corps, for the businesses across the board, getting that expensing and being one of the first out of the gate, there's the advantage to being a first mover, and I think this is definitely the case for Mississippi.
I just want to add, for the benefit of the group, I also serve on the Madison County Economic Development Authority, and we happen to have our monthly board meeting this morning. And while I can't say too much about it because it's discussion in executive session, we of course are working on some rather large economic development projects. This actually came up. This particular suitor is aware of this legislation, and they are looking at making significant investment year one in capital equipment, which would qualify for the full expensing. And it is a differentiator with the other states that we are competing with. I mean, this is the kind of, I think, actionable policy that yields results, and we need to keep doing more like that. And that's why I want to ask you about, John, besides our income tax reform, which I think was fantastic. We still got some more work to do. We want full elimination. But where do we stack up relative to the other states in your view in that respect? And I know, Jonathan, you can talk about that as well. How do we look like versus Colorado in that respect?
I think you look terrific versus Colorado. There are 3 pots that most states dip into for revenue. There's income tax, there's property tax, and there's sales tax or some type of consumption tax. Income tax is a vile tax because people need it to live. Property tax is also a perverse tax in that you've already purchased something. This is yours, and you have to pay ransom in order to keep what you already have. And it is a ransom. Consumption tax is probably the most ethical tax of all of them, and there are problems of equity, making sure that you do this so that people who don't have as much can afford it. And there's certainly ways to do that. That's why flat, low taxes that are transparent are most important. And what I've seen in my many years of doing this is that those people who want more tax revenue are superb at hiding taxes. and to the point where even when we're talking about fees, hiding these taxes as fees, Colorado is the only state that has a bed tax called a fee. It's a way to get Medicaid money from the feds. They call it a fee, so we didn't have to vote on it. But on your hospital bill, it is not allowed to be on your hospital bill. So you get your outrageous hospital bill. Who are you angry at? Not at the government for the tax, because you can't find it. You're angry at the hospital, so you're angry at the industry. The other tax that we don't call a tax is regulatory. And Colorado, now that it is a wholly blue state, every lever of power is in progressive hands right now, which makes our income tax cuts really pretty impressive. Again, because of the initiative process, we were able to go directly to the people. The people want tax cuts, even though they've put in a legislature that keeps putting in restrictive regulatory burdens. They've outlawed plastic bags and plastic straws. They put the energy industry out of state. It's killing us. The regulatory burden is a tax burden. So you're talking about depreciation. So let me put 4 taxes out there. The 4th one is a regulatory burden, which is just a tax that people don't see. But I guarantee you, in those businesses that are looking into Mississippi, as they're taking a look at where to locate, they're looking at state and local regulatory regimes and seeing where will they be today, but also where will they be in 5 and 10 years if they're going to make an investment in Mississippi. Those are the 4 areas that they are making a decision. So if you want to keep going up these important rankings that ALEC does, they are incredible what ALEC does. Those are the areas you need to look at, and to keep all 4 of those levels low, because the people might not be looking at it, the media might not be looking at it, but the people who are rising these scores of people who are on that wagon and on that ranking, those are the 4 things they're looking at.
Yeah. Russ, I know you're incredibly intimately familiar with the regulatory framework as it is in the state of Mississippi. I know you've done a lot of work on that to reform some of those, what we feel like are impediments from a regulatory perspective to economic growth. You've met with lots of lawmakers in our capital. You know a lot about this. What should we be doing from a regulatory perspective? I know licensing reform is a big area that we've worked on.
Also, I would not allow any Californians in, just as a...
You know, Northern California's not that bad.
That's right.
There are a lot of good folks in Northern California. It's just when you get south is the problem.
I suggest building a wall, but not where you think.
You know, one thing I'd say in response to John is we actually have a lot of hidden taxes in Mississippi, too. If you went to the Department of Revenue's website, you'd find a list of all the taxes and fees that are collected at the state level. There are 99 of them the last time I checked. And so while you can think of income taxes and property taxes and sales taxes, there's a vast plethora of things that you're unaware of. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with a lady about the gas tax, and she told me, well, I don't pay the gas tax in Mississippi. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure you do, unless you've got some special card when you go to the pump. But it's because it doesn't show up on the receipt. So you don't know when you look at the receipt that there's, 36.5 cents baked in to the price of your gallon of gas on every gallon that you pump. So there's plenty of hidden taxes in Mississippi, too. And we should be working on transparency and simplicity as we think about the tax side. The regulatory side, I think, we've played what I would call a game of whack-a-mole. That's not to say that we haven't done good things, right? We've seen a license that maybe shouldn't exist, and we've curbed it a little bit to make it easier for people to work. Or we've done something like universal recognition that allows somebody who's in a licensed profession in another state to move into Mississippi and resume their practice without having to jump through the same hoops, just based on the fact that they're licensed in another state. But if you were to look at Mississippi's regulatory code, what you would find is that we're the most regulated state in the entire Southeast. And to give you some sort of functional equivalent, we've got enough regulatory words in our regulatory administrative code in Mississippi that would be the equivalent of reading William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying 9 times, right? So there's a lot of regulatory requirements built in. What I would suggest is that a lot of the individual things that have been done are good, and they're helpful to people, but we need to think of this systemically, the way that we thought about tax reform systemically, which is to say, can we do something like red tape reduction? The British Columbians in Canada did this, and it became a model for the United States. But essentially what they did is they went to government administrators, what sometimes conservatives will call bureaucrats, and said, hey, look, we want to reduce the number of regulatory requirements in our administrative code by 1/3, and we want to do it in a certain time period. And instead of making them the enemy, they made them partners in figuring out how to modernize, streamline the regulatory code. And the end result was that in 3 years, they'd cut 40% of their regulatory requirements in British Columbia. And it became a model for other states that have done similar things. I think something like red tape reduction very much could be something that would be in play in Mississippi, that you could see an opportunity for real partnership with the agencies. I think the other thing that I would say, and Wisconsin did this to Midland effect, but I still think something like a REINS Act could be done, which effectively makes it so that unelected bureaucrats can't just constantly create new regulations, right? It creates an additional check on that system. One of the cool things that's happening right now, and this is happening on a national level, is that the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that they're kind of tired of the regulatory state. Mm-hmm. And so you see the Supreme Court in decisions like the Sackett decision sort of pulling back on the EPA as an example and saying, no, you can't treat a drainage ditch as a navigable body of water that requires millions of dollars in mitigation fees in order for somebody to develop that piece of property. Well, we think about Sackett as being a Midwest case. Well, the implications for that for Mississippi are huge. Mississippi Gulf Coast has all sorts of development now that can be done that previously was cost prohibitive because of what the U.S. Supreme Court did. What I'd love to see is sort of a comprehensive approach of state leaders of saying, we're getting new opportunities because strings are being cut at a national level. We have an opportunity at state level to develop a comprehensive plan, not to make us an unregulated state, not to create anarchy, but to create a situation where there's a bigger opportunity for growth in the state. There's a bigger opportunity for capital investment. John's exactly right, that you got the tax side and the regulatory side of this thing. We're dealing with the tax side. We're encouraging people to make capital investment. Now we need to get the regulatory side right so that there are not barriers to making that capital investment. And candidly, that does help get more people off the back of the wagon into the front of the wagon.
Yeah, no doubt. I would argue that probably the stripping of the regulatory state under the Trump years probably had a larger impact on growing the economy and honestly keeping inflation in check at the same time than did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, than did tax policy. I mean, they worked in concert, but we had the policy of what? Had to kill 2 regulations for every new one added, I believe, which is a pretty good idea. But as soon as President Biden was elected, he got the pen out and I think ran out of ink the first day, signing all the executive orders to create more regulations.
The fiefdoms that happen inside the regulatory state are amazing, and I'm seeing this under the governor we have now, Gerard, who has a great national reputation from everyone who does not live in Colorado. And what happens is you build out all these people who answer to no one, and they have their own fiefdoms and new powers and more new powers without any sort of check and balance. And if we do it correctly, new regulations should be accountable to someone. If we did not see this anywhere, we should have seen it in COVID with the emergency orders that went up to people who were never elected. We had county officials who were appointed who shut down businesses, and you can't vote them out of office. This should have been the wake-up call that said people who aren't elected shouldn't have that accountability. To bring it back to Tabor for just a quick second, when we put things into fees, we talk about fees as a way to do this. You said nobody pays taxes. I don't pay taxes. In Colorado, you're right on gasoline because they now have for the first time in history, a gas fee. That way we didn't have to report on it or vote on it. So when Tabor was passed in 1992, about 1/3 of the state budget was in what we call fees. They call them enterprises, tuition and other things that were run by appointees. 2/3 of the budget, the bigger pot, was run by the General Assembly, the General Fund. People we elect took care of that. Now, just 30 years later, after these court orders, now with all the fees, it has switched. 2/3 of our money, of the state's money, is being run by appointed people, not elected people. If this doesn't hit you for a second, let me draw it out. We had a revolution because we had taxation without representation. In my state, 2/3 of the money, 2/3 of everything, of our priorities, are being spent by people we didn't elect. We have taxation without representation. And then when you add into that the taxation through regulation, almost everything we do is being run by people we've never elected. Democracy is in danger. And it's not from where we think, it's from the regulatory state and how we do taxation. The very fiber of what we fought for at the beginning of this country is at risk right now. And I don't think we realize the threat.
Might even be more pronounced at the federal level, and because I think the Congress gets frustrated, they can't get anything through, and so it just sort of defaults and matriculates down to the administrative state. We also saw the EPA case, right, with West Virginia. I think sort of launched the series of cases that have made their way to the Supreme Court, challenging the authority of this bureaucratic state without something directly from the Congress. Jonathan, I also wanted to just pick your brain, I guess, while you're here about what can we do to capitalize on the momentum that we're realizing here in Mississippi. We've had sweeping tax reform. The immediate expensing provision is something that is very much pro-growth policies. What else can we do to really boost the economy here and improve even into a greater extent the long-term economic outlook for our state?
Well, I think the first lesson is don't rest on your laurels. You've done some impressive things, but so are states all across the country, right? And so I think, when we look at our research, for instance, how do you make Mississippi more like the freedom-loving states out there, like Tennessee and Florida and Texas, right? And the states that are growing. By the way, Florida's gaining nearly 1,000 people a day from the other 49 states on net, while California, their counterpart, losing nearly 1,000 people per day with some of the best weather on earth, by the way. Anybody that's spent any time in California has to scratch their heads and wonder,
pay a lot for
how
that
in the world do
weather.
they lose the people, right? I mean, it's just unbelievable. And so, I think that's, in short, be more like Texas and Florida and less like California and New York. That's the key lessons. Now, drilling down into the specifics, one thing that I wanted also add in, and John hit on this, Tabor is it is the gold standard. It's an incredibly important tool to limit the growth of government, because how do you get from 22 to 15 to 10 to 5 to be in the top 5, let's say, and compete with those top tier states? And I think how you do that is really rebalancing the size and scope of government and the cost of government and what that means in order to then buy down tax rates and continue this progress. Because businesses we were talking about earlier, they value certainty above almost anything else outside of lower rates, right, and more competitive policies. And so they want to know that this progress isn't a one-time progress, that you're going to continue to make gains and progress and build on those successes. And so the way I think to do this, and following, what I've been in about 30 states so far this year talking with legislators, and I think we are seeing now a renewed sense that, President Biden, the federal economy, there's a lot of headwinds that we're facing. Real declining wages, as we're seeing with the new inflation print that just came out once again. It's going to be a question of not if, but when we see a national collapse in the economy again. And so how are we preparing for that? And I think the way to do that, then, so you don't have to backtrack and do what some states did, which was cut taxes and then raise taxes during the financial crisis, and learning from those mistakes, is you get spending under control. As it turns out, let's say the 9 states without personal income taxes, the secret to their success, the secret sauce, so to speak, is that they spend between 50 and 60% less per person than the states with income taxes, in the 41 states with income taxes. How do you make government more efficient? When you look at the rich states, poor states rankings, for instance, one of the things that sticks out still to this day that keeps Mississippi's ranking, let's say, out of the top 20 right now, is that Mississippi's state and local government workforce is larger than all of those but 5 other states across the country when you adjust for population. And so why is it that it takes that many more government employees to get the same functions relatively done that other states are doing? That's a big open question, I think. Another thing that we're going to be releasing next week, which really ties into this topic, is we're going to be releasing the annual study of the unfunded pension liabilities and state pension plans across the country. And I can share a little bit of breaking news on that once again, Mississippi is going to be in the highest 10 group of states on highest unfunded liabilities in the pension systems across the country. In fact, that's a group of states you don't want to be in the same neighborhood of. California, New York, many
Illinois.
of the states that are doing many of the worst things on pensions, and one of the only red states in that mix. And so tackling big challenges like this, and I realize, this is an election year here. These are topics that are not for the faint of heart, but real leaders that want to continue the progress that you've made here will take on these challenges, because at the end of the day, I think one of my favorite economists, I think a national hero, anybody a fan of Thomas Sowell here out at Hoover at Stanford? I mean, the first law of economics is what? A scarcity of resources, right? But the first law of politics, as Sowell says, is to ignore the first law of economics. And so we have to overcome that hurdle and have principled leaders that are willing to take on these challenges.
Yeah, you made a great point, and I just want to offer this for the group. I know there's lots of entrepreneurs in here, including members of our legislature who have been in the chair of an entrepreneur and had to make difficult business decisions. I've always thought that faith, confidence, and certainty drive investment, hiring, and expansion. If you've got faith, confidence, and certainty, you're just more willing to take risk. If you don't, and you're always worried about, oh my gosh, what's the government going to do to me next? It's like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is scheduled at this point to expire, the individual provisions, which would also ensnare lots of sub-S and small businesses at the end of 25. Your taxes are going up. I mean, that's the bottom line. Unless action is taken, we're probably staging an epic battle in the Congress, I think, over the next couple of years, certainly in the next congressional class, to deal with that. But faith, confidence, and certainty, and we can do that here in Mississippi. And I think we have a legislature, and I would pose this question to you, Russ. There seems to be more interest on the part of our state lawmakers of stabilizing and normalizing economic policies and adopting pro-growth economic policies. The tax cuts is certainly a great example of that, and trying to sort of cut through some of the burdensome regulatory framework. What else should we be doing, Russ?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think you're right. The legislature has done good work. That certainly doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of good work still in front of us. And there are challenges. I mean, obviously, we've experienced economic growth, but the entire country in part has experienced economic growth because of inflation.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't feel real to a lot of people. And certainly to the average person trying to make the money work at the end of the month when groceries are 23% higher and energy's 34% higher in this time that we're in, there's difficulty. I think the legislature has been wise in not rushing to spend the surplus that itself is somewhat driven by inflation. And so I think there's wisdom in not trying to spend as new dollars come in right now because of what probably is in front of us at some point. They've done a fairly good job so far in not burning a hole in their pocket. But that's something that needs to continue. You know, certainly, you know, I'd love to see us continue on the path to income tax elimination. I think there's a way to do it that's combined with a tax and expenditure limit. Candidly, some of the original legislation 3 years ago had what was too aggressive of a tax and expenditure limit in it, right? They were going to phase down the income tax with a 1.5% trigger on inflation. Well, in the environment that we're in, that was unworkable. But a population plus inflation type standard could be workable as a way to continue to phase down the rate. And the reason that you want to do that ultimately, I mean, we're talking about full expensing and income tax rates and all this boring stuff. The goal is to get capital expenditure in Mississippi.
That's right.
The goal is to get people who invest in Mississippi to increase the productivity of the workers that we've got, to get new people working. Because if we do those things, then ultimately we're going to be more successful as a state. We're going to be less dependent on the government for our success. We're going to be more able to take care of our families. And so when we talk about the minutia of these policies, understand that these are tools to try and achieve a much bigger goal. And so if you look at Tennessee, Florida, Texas, what you see, and it's not just them, but you know, the 9 states that have no income tax, what you see in those states is population growth that is double the national average, GDP growth that's 38% above the national average, per capita income that's far above the national average. There's something to this idea of not punishing people for being productive. The flip side of that is this. We need to be careful that we're not creating incentives that prevent people from being productive or that encourage people not to go out and find opportunities. And so as we have big, important conversations about things like healthcare policy, we just need to be careful as we think about what that looks like to make sure that we're not, in fact, making the situation worse of that labor force participation rate problem, right? That we're not encouraging more people to get in the back of the wagon. Instead, we're encouraging more people to be productive, contributing citizens. I think the biggest part of that, and I'll close with this thought, is if you think about Mississippi's biggest problem, in my mind, it's a psychological problem. We for a long time have accepted that we're supposed to be last. We for a long time have accepted that there are people who are among us that are not going to be productive, right? And that those people have to be taken care of in some sort of patriarchal or paternalistic way. And if we're ever going to be anything more as a state, we've got to break that psychological barrier, because there's no reason that we can't be as productive in people as California, Texas, Florida, so on and so forth. We've got all the talent in the world. We've got all the sort of ambition in the world. We've got to break that psychological barrier. And if we can do that in concert with good policy, we're going to see real results.
Totally agree.
If I can add
Sure.
a quick warning
Hey,
here.
Jonathan, yep.
It sounds to me that for the policymakers in Mississippi, you're in a dangerous spot right now. You've got a surplus of overpayment. You've got a surplus because of your own good budgeting and restraint. And if there is hard times coming, this makes for a danger I've seen in state after state, where when it comes, their surpluses are attacked. I have seen it in state after state that every fund gets raided. One of the things that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights have done well is to define what an emergency resource is, that there are emergency funds, and what they're used for. Is it a natural disaster? Is it an economic disaster? Is it a recession? That if you're going to put these funds in some sort of reserve for hard times, that it is constitutionally structured when you can do it. I have seen tax restrictions, I think it was in Kansas, that said we can't raise taxes except with a supermajority of vote. And so they just used a majority vote to change the rules to a simple majority vote.
Like a filibuster.
You're right, exactly. Those type of games. But I've also seen every time that good legislators try to protect what they've done, that it fails. And that's where a constitutional change has to protect those funds. If not, I strongly advise you, send the money to the safest place you can, which is back to the people who earned the money in the first place, and get it out of the government, where it will be safe for Mississippians.
John?
Just 100% of what those two gentlemen just said as well. But one thing I wanted to pick up on what Russ said, he was talking about like making sure that incentives aren't created incorrectly to have people that are more dependent on government. That's probably the more important point, but I think another really important point, especially from my vantage point being up in that land of make-believe in Washington, the island surrounded by reality, as Reagan called it. You know, in Washington, D.C. right now, we carry nearly $33 trillion, all of us, look around the room. We all carry nearly $33 trillion in national debt. Last financial crisis, when we were talking about sending money and bailing out states the last time with the Obama bucks, we were at less than $10 trillion national debt today, and now today 33. I think we have to ask ourselves a question. If we want to have strong, self-sufficient states, we believe in this idea of state autonomy that we've been talking about, that states should have this idea to compete with each other, right, and have the best ideas bubble up, or let people, because actually at the end of the day, when states compete with each other, people win, right? It's like the old car insurance commercial, right? When they have to compete with each other, who's the winner? But at the end of the day, one thing that we have to guard against, and I know this is something where Mississippi and other states struggle mightily, and that is our dependence on the federal dollars, right? In this era of $33 trillion of national debt, once again, we have to ask ourselves the question of really, it's not if, but it's when the federal government will need to reduce their payments to the states, and all these programs are being created. And those of us who believe in this federalist system, I think like the founders did, I mean, this is an incredible American experiment that we have. Almost nowhere around the world replicates this idea of autonomous subnational governments allowed to compete with each other in essentially a 50-state free trade zone. And that's exactly what the founders wanted. That only works, folks, if we allow the good people here in Jackson, around the state of Mississippi, to continue making the important decisions that will make Mississippi more prosperous going forward, and making all of your lives and your family's lives more prosperous going forward. The more we really subjugate ourselves to those in Washington, D.C. through this myth that there's such a thing as a free lunch. That was always Milton Friedman's warning. There is no such thing as a free lunch, ladies and gentlemen. The more we take from Washington, D.C., the more controls. They're not strings. I was once corrected in saying the federal strings that come with these dollars will last far longer than the dollars. They're not strings, they're chains that come from Washington, D.C. that really subjugate the states into what's going on. And the last thing we want to do, right, with any state, as I travel around the 50, is hitch our economic wagons to the mess that is Washington, D.C. right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, John. So Jonathan, I know that you're constantly tracking policy efforts in other states that are related, of course, to economic matters. What are you seeing in particular right now that we should be thinking about in Mississippi?
Well, I think it's this is a 50-year high surplus scenario that we see across states around the country. And I've often said, half jokingly, that if we can't cut taxes in a scenario like this, we might as well just give up the ghost and give up the tax cutting card, right?
Yeah,
it's not going to happen. So I think we're seeing, as I mentioned, nearly half the states have substantially cut personal income taxes. That is where I think one of the largest bang of the buck comes when it comes to reducing taxes on entrepreneurs and small businesses. Because to Russ's point, this isn't about just marginal tax rates. This is about making people's lives better off and getting employers to move into states like Mississippi. I mean, I come from a little city in Michigan, Saginaw, Michigan, that's gone from 100,000 people to under 50,000 in the last 50 years. And how do you reverse that out-migration that you've seen here in Mississippi? I think you've got to keep up with the tax cutting that's going on, but also to do that is examining regulation, examining the federal requirements coming with the federal dollars, and then, of course, at the end of the day, looking at the spending, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all about the spending. The true burden of government is government spending. That is the true tax burden. And so figuring out ways to get to a more efficient provision of those key government services that we know we need in states across the country is, I think, going to be the way to do that. But you do fall behind by standing still. I'm confident, though, that the legislators here in Jackson that have begun this great work with the expensing and the tax cuts will continue that progress.
Final question for John, and that is, can full income tax elimination and a taxpayer bill of rights coexist?
Without a doubt. We made the flat tax happen before the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Taxpayer Bill of Rights was a constitutional change which then locked in the flat tax rate. And then every time since we have stepped down the income tax rate, it locks it into the Constitution, requiring then a vote of the people to raise it back up. So it's been a mixture of legislative changes like you've done here in Mississippi, and from the Independence Institute, my organization, putting it on the ballot and bringing it down. What we've done is to bring it down little by little by little, and saying what we have. If there is a surplus, the best way to do it, instead of giving it back, let's just do a little income tax cut, and then another little income tax cut, and because now's the time to do that. I want to win the war. I want to bring back Colorado. I've lost the Colorado that I grew up in, and it breaks my heart. Colorado was a free state where people would go to write their own biography. It really was the West. Those of us who are Ayn Rand fans, she put Gulch in Colorado, the mythic place of freedom, for a reason. She would not put it there now. And I want that place back. And I think the first and most important step is to get rid of the income tax and then get a handle on the property tax and then to take back the regulatory state. And I want that Colorado, that American spirit to live again. And I look at what you guys are doing and what you guys are doing here in Empower Mississippi is just has such a flame. And I tell you, I don't see Mississippi as last in my book here. Spend some time in Colorado and you'll see that Colorado is going in one direction, and because of these organizations, what Mississippi is doing, it's going in a different direction. I find it inspiring.
Appreciate that, John. Jonathan, John, Russ, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your insights, and let's unleash Mississippi. Thanks, everyone.